Slight pause.
So let's get right into it. For centuries, one of the biggest mysteries in Christianity has been what exactly happened to Christ in those 3 days between his crucifixion and resurrection. The popular image, right? It's this dramatic journey into a fiery underworld. But what if the original texts, what if they point to something completely different? Well, today, we're going to dig into that very question. It really all kicks off with this one famous line from the Apostles' Creed. He descended into hell. I mean, that's a phrase that has literally shaped art, theology, our whole imagination, painting this picture of a heroic Christ battling demons in a fiery pit. But to really get it, we have to ask a super critical question. Yeah, what does the Bible actually mean by the word hell? At least in this context. Are we talking about a place of fire and torment? Or could it mean something else entirely? To find out, we've got to become detectives and look for clues right inside the scripture itself. And our first clue is all about linguistics. We need to unpack the original meaning of that word, hell, in a really foundational Old Testament verse. This right here, this is Psalm 16, verse 10. It's a prophecy that Christians believe points directly to Jesus. And yeah, on the surface, it seems to lock it in. His soul will not be left in hell. But there's a really crucial detail kind of hidden in the translation. Okay, now this is where it gets super interesting. The original Hebrew word used here is Sheol, and that is the word that gets translated as hell. But if you look throughout the Old Testament, Sheol almost never means a place of burning torment. It most often just means the grave, the pit, or, the state of being dead. And notice how the second half of the verse connects it to corruption, that physical decay of a body. And here's the really cool part. We don't even have to guess what this verse means. The source material brings up this great principle. The Bible often interprets itself, and that's exactly what happens here. Hundreds of years later, in the book of Acts, the Apostle Peter stands up and directly explains this exact psalm. So get this, the crucial point Peter makes is that the verse isn't about an escape from fire, it's about the resurrection. He says David, the guy who wrote the psalm, is still dead and buried. But the prophecy was actually about the Messiah, whose body would not be abandoned in the grave to decay or to see corruption. So the victory wasn't escaping torment, it was conquering death itself. And this just lays it out perfectly. The common view, sees this dramatic rescue from a fiery place. But the biblical context, as Peter himself explains it, points to a physical preservation from decay in the tomb, which is what sets the stage for the resurrection. All right, let's move on to our second clue and see how this all builds. This one comes from another phrase that, at first glance, really seems to point to some kind of underworld journey. So the Apostle Paul writes this in his letter to the Ephesians. Descended into the lower parts of the earth. I mean, that sounds pretty definitive, doesn't it? It immediately makes you think of some deep subterranean world. But again, context is everything. You see, this isn't the only place this kind of poetic language gets used. And if we look back into the Old Testament, we can actually find a really clear definition of what the lower parts of the earth meant to a biblical author. Take a look at Psalm 63. Here, David says his enemies will go into the lower parts of the earth. And what does that mean? Well, the very next verse clarifies that they will fall by the sword. It's just a poetic way of saying they'll be killed and buried in a grave. So what we're seeing is that the phrase really signifies the ultimate humiliation, burial in the tomb. It's a descent from life itself, down into the dust of the earth. From this point of view, Christ's descent wasn't to some underworld, but a descent from the throne of heaven all the way down to the humble, quiet confines of a grave. All right, on to our third and final clue. And honestly, this is maybe the most complex passage of them all, and it's the one that gets used most often to prove that Christ preached to spirits in hell after he died. Here it is, 1 Peter 3:19. He went and preached unto the spirits in prison. I mean, wow, that seems like an open and shut case, right? But the grammar here, and the verses right around it, they reveal a completely different timeline. Okay, let's break this one down step by step. The passage says Christ preached by which, and if you look at the verse right before, that refers to the Spirit. So point one, the preaching was done by the Spirit of Christ. But when did this happen? Well, the very next verse tells us, crystal clear, it was in the days of Noah.
So according to this interpretation, the Spirit of Christ was preaching through Noah to all the disobedient people of that generation. And those people who rejected the message way back then are the ones who are now described as spirits in prison, awaiting final judgment. So you see, the preaching event didn't happen between the cross and the resurrection. It happened centuries earlier.
So after all that, what's the verdict? Let's put all the evidence together on the table. When you lay it all out like this, a really consistent theme starts to emerge, doesn't it? Hell is contextually interpreted as the grave. The lower parts of the earth is seen as the humiliation of burial, and the preaching to spirits looks like an event that actually took place in Noah's time. All the evidence seems to point away from a journey into torment.
And this brings us to that final, crucial statement from Christ on the cross: it is finished. The argument here is that the work of atonement, of paying for sin, it was completed right there, in that moment. There was no further suffering or work left to be done in some fiery pit. The price was paid, in full.
So what's the big takeaway here? According to this analysis of the source material, Christ's descent wasn't some journey into fire, but a descent into the reality of human death and the deep silence of the tomb. It was the absolute lowest point of humiliation, just before the greatest moment of victory, the resurrection. The descent wasn't into hellfire, but into the grave, the very thing he would ultimately defeat. And that wraps up our look into this really fascinating theological question.